All right, good morning, everyone. How are you? Thank you to our colleagues online who've been waiting patiently. We had some of our in-person participants go on an early morning adventure, and we wanted to make sure they had time to get settled. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our first session of the day, which is going to focus on tech practices as navigating information, knowledges, and publics. And we have two terrific speakers, the first of which I'll introduce right now. Dr. Burcu Baykurt is an assistant professor of media studies at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Her research examines how digital infrastructures reshape and perpetuate durable inequalities as well as technologies of statecraft. And technologies of statecraft, she means a range of things, including tech nationalism, to smart borders, to the use of automated decision systems in public agencies. Too early in the morning for me. She's currently working on a book, Smart as a City, which is based on fieldwork and interviews conducted over 3 years in a city where residents and public officials have partnered with Google to test a gigabit internet service and Cisco to test a smart city program. And we're looking forward to hearing more about that work now.
Thank you so much. Can you guys hear me fine? Okay, perfect. Because I think I'm going to keep my mask on. I don't have COVID, but I do have a bit of a cold, and I don't want to be spreading the sinus infection around. One sec. Okay, I got my timer. All right, thank you, Kate, for the warm introduction. So I want to start with giving you a background, if I can make this work. Yes. As Kate mentioned, I have been working on a book project, which is hopefully going to be out next year, based on a US cities, and that city is Kansas City, if anyone's curious, 3-year effort to put together a smart city pilot, and basically like what happens to smart cities as an idea, but also as a set of practices in a city that's been divided deeply by class, race, and all kinds of inequalities that come attached with that. I'm not going to talk about that book project today, but if anyone is curious or if you see that work resonating with you, I'm more than happy to chat with you. I have also published on topics of algorithmic accountability, what I call the geopolitics of the internet, the global internet historically, and in the sort of contemporary times. I had the pleasure to collaborate with Alfonsina to work on like automated borders, like what does it mean to put together a predictable border at a UN agency. And all of that, I'm giving you this background to tell you that my work has always been interested in understanding how public officials, state agencies, try to sort of grapple with this transition to so-called automated systems. But I have to say, like most of the time, these systems don't work. They are mostly aspirations. They create a lot of confusion, and I have to say a ton of ignorance among public agencies. So I walk into these projects with that critical understanding in mind that I assume they won't work, and if they happen to work, they're probably going to worsen the existing inequalities, whatever it is that they're trying to address. The project I'm going to talk about today is a new one. The paper that the talk is based on is complete, but I'm planning to expand on that. So if you have any comments, any suggestions, I'll be very much looking forward to them. And I prepared some questions for you at the end, but feel free to bring your own questions to this project. So how many of you have heard the term Gov-Tech? Just show of hands. Okay, I don't have time to ask what it is, but I'm going to assume that you know what that means. So Gov-Tech often is used to describe technologies adopted by government agencies, right? Like it could be in-house, it could be, I've heard it sort of being used as like civic tech also, like those civic technologists who come into public agencies and collaborate with public officials. There are also adjacent terms like the datafied state. You might have heard of that as well, and I'm happy to talk about it if anyone's interested. So I'm choosing to go with Gov-Tech, particularly because there's also a subset of tech companies, and I'm mostly speaking from the United States context here, that are very interested in sort of getting government contracts, like going into public agencies, working with government offices, offer their sort of expertise in data science, data visualization, and some of these companies are very well established, like you might have heard companies like Esri, Tableau, even ArcGIS actually is a big player in this space. And then pretty much every sort of big tech company like Microsoft, Amazon, IBM, like have a government unit where they're trying to get government contracts and get their products like software into public agencies. Some of these companies are very niche. They do like only one thing, like we're going to help you with like your housing problems in the city or public health. And some of them are kind of like a one-stop shop for everything that you can imagine, as long as it is data related. I'm just like showing you some of the images from these companies. The way that these firms like sort of peddle their products is to really just use the, as a government agency, you need to work with data and let us help you with it. Like, so there's not much hype or a promise of innovation or, like just sort of like shiny gadgets, if you will. Like, since I did work on smart cities, like I feel like there's a distinction here. But they really just sort of come in and say, like, as government agencies, we know you need to work with data. We know you're getting pressure to make automated decision systems, like adopt automated decision systems. So let us help you. And then interestingly, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, there's also this sort of tying of the use of data to these governments' objectives to achieve like sort of social justice. If it's a municipality or like a federal agency, we know you need to like sort of achieve equity, be responsible about like social justice in your jurisdiction, and let us help you with that by using data, kind of a promise. So really quickly about what this project is based on. It's a very small exploratory work. I interviewed 12 Gov-Tech companies, mostly startups, and we can talk about why I chose to go with startups instead of like big companies, and like Palantir and stuff, like, and I'm happy to hear your thoughts on this decision. I collected the contracts of these firms, and I'm still collecting, so if anyone has any ideas about like what to do with those contracts, like I would love to hear. I obviously approach it like a qualitative researcher, and I do like deep reading of these contracts. But if there is anything that could be done in a creative way, I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on that. I also like sort of went through all the demos, corporate web blogs, and these companies keep ridiculously extensive blogs, by the way, if anyone's interested. The project is designed kind of like an economic sociology project. So in the interviews, I asked these founders and chief data scientists about the value of their companies and products. And that value means multiple things. So I asked them about like the motivations for entering this market, the products and services they offer to their clients, how they articulate the value of these to their clients, but also how do they articulate the value to their investors, since most of these are startups. And I have to tell you that the answers changed widely when I switched from clients to investors, which I think is important to keep in mind if you're doing this kind of work. So I'm going to do this very quickly, just a kind of like a theoretical framework, literature review slide, but just to tell you where I'm coming from into this project. So what I'm trying to understand is to get further into the political economy of what is often called the data-fied state, the sort of turn in government agencies to make data-driven decisions, which has a longer history, if anyone's familiar with sort of political economy of the state or policy studies. Like, this goes way back to the late 60s, early 70s. Neoliberalism obviously makes it even sort of more challenging for these agencies and make them feel the pressure of like having to bring evidence and data more and more. But with the sort of rise of digital technologies, obviously there is a continuation, but also like a kind of a qualitative shift into transferring the techniques from, say, like statistics or economics, sort of economic theories, to automated decision systems, which kind of brings new challenges or brings in like more actors into the government decision-making space, from civic technologists to these tech companies. But one of the sort of, oops, my graph is not working well, but just imagine a bunch of eyes blinking. But what I want to challenge here is this concept of surveillance capitalism, which should have been on the screen right now. So I think like when we start thinking about, like especially from the state's perspective, but in general, obviously, when we try to make sense of the political economy of the current landscape, we often go to surveillance capitalism as a way to explain what's going on. And I don't need to like kind of explain this concept to this crowd, and I have zero problems with that. Like I'm not challenging that. But at the same time, when I look at like how public agencies build relationships with tech companies, I feel like the picture, the empirical picture I see, doesn't really fit perfectly with the concept of surveillance capitalism, starting with it's never an all-encompassing, like this sort of panopticon-y vision that we see from the perspective of these companies. They're not always interested in collecting data. Unlike Facebooks and Instagrams and TikToks and whatever, like those sort of consumer-facing social media platforms, there's not much tailoring to like user behavior. And there is also not much sort of coherence in terms of platforms. So what I see actually most of the time, a government agency working with a bunch of companies through different sort of platforms. None of them speak to each other, and it's kind of a mess. And the sort of what you might call, like if I could use an SDS term, the assemblage that emerges is much messier than I think what surveillance capitalism suggests we might be seeing. And again, I'm not challenging the concept. I find a lot of use in that, but I'm also trying to sort of, okay, if I can't use surveillance capitalism to explain what I'm seeing, what else could be helpful to help us understand this particular moment? So for that, I went to one of my favorite texts by Philip Agre. If you haven't checked out his work, he's brilliant. And this particular paper, Surveillance and Capture, he actually talks about privacy. So it's not, has nothing to do with government, tech, and anything like subject matter. It's very different. But he makes this like really helpful distinction between surveillance and capture, and I take this distinction as like two models of power, if you will. And he says capture, as opposed to surveillance, coming from like computing itself, is a helpful way to understand an alternative way to conceptualize how power operates in the current digital society. And by capture, he means both the acquisition of data, like the grabbing of data, like capturing information, and then modeling or translating like social reality, whatever it is that we're trying to capture, into a computing language. So unlike constant monitoring and recording of new information, which would be surveillance, capture emphasizes the process of parsing human activities into computing, into computer languages themselves, and then the subsequent interventions that facilitate it. So it sounds very technical, but Agre himself acknowledges that this is actually an incredibly social and political process, and we need to look at like what are the sort of realities or informationable activities that are sort of being computed in the process, instead of only looking at monitoring and sort of turning that into information. So I suggest if you use capture as a framework to understand Gov-Tech, it actually opens up a bunch of new questions for us. Like we can ask things like, what kind of data in government agencies are fit to be captured and generate value on the Gov-Tech market? How does this change the relationship between these tech companies and public agencies? And then obviously, like, what is the larger change that's happening as we bring the logics of computing and computation into governance more and more? And what is that, like, possibly slow but quite radical shift that's happening? And I think this perspective also, like, makes us pay attention to the mundane ways that public officials try to switch whatever they are doing into computing and computing languages. And then, which, you know, ultimately get monetized in the market, by the way. Like, I never want us to forget that aspect, that step. Okay, so I have 10 minutes left, and I'm gonna walk you quickly through my empirical data and what I call the 3 steps toward capture. The first 2 steps will be kind of modeled after Agra's distinction, and then the third one I think will be more familiar to those of you who sort of look at the political economy of this space. So one of the really interesting things about this process, the interviews, was that like all these startup founders were first of all quick to draw a line between themselves and Silicon Valley. Like they were like, we're not here to save anything, we're just like trying to help these public agencies, we're not parachuting in, our products are very mundane, very simple, we're not reinventing anything. They all had these like sort of personal stories about like how they used to work in civic tech, how they had a stint in public agencies, like whether it was a local government or something else, or at the very least some personal story about something that went wrong in their city and they got excited to like help. But at the same time, they kept coming back to this idea of like, but we know how to do things better and public agencies need this, so we can like bring our simple tools into governments, and like who doesn't want that? But when I asked them to walk me through their like sort of work processes, they always started from this idea of like, oh yeah, when we start working with an agency, we just go in and get everything that they have. Like all the data that they have, we try to grab it. And you know, they try to sort of explain this through like only through getting everything we can start seeing connections, we can start like helping them, and that's also like especially good because most of these public agencies want to achieve racial justice, social justice, and they don't know enough about the different minoritized groups that live in their sort of cities or that live in their jurisdictions. So we can just like sort of bring that demographic data and layer it with other data. But in order for us to be able to do that, we need to grab everything first. So like data grab seems to be the first act of capture in Gov-Tech. But then comes the bundling of different types of data, and that's where things started like getting really interesting. So the second act was, as I told you before, blending different types of data sets with the claim that like whatever was emerging will be really helpful for decision making. And this is sort of the second version that Agra talks about, like sort of breaking data into different units in order to be computed kind of idea. So for example, census figures and a city's housing inventory, for example, could be blended to help the city to make decisions about affordable housing. And to really kind of show you how this generated value, let me share this. Okay, it looks good. Like quick exchange on LinkedIn. One of these Gov-Tech firms was sort of promoting the release of county health rankings on LinkedIn, being very hypey and whatever. And then someone like commented on the LinkedIn page, okay, wait a minute, like since county health ranking is freely available on the internet, it's government data. Census data that you seem to be blending it with, also free. So is your product free as well? And you know, the first response, and I don't know if you can see it clearly, was very much like hypey, great question, but like our data library is actually like really special and you should check it out and email us. And then the person is like insisting, but you didn't answer my question. Is it free or not? And someone else jumped in and said, no, it's not. And there was actually a comment from the CEO that he later deleted when he was saying, one of my favorite things is like we take this important public data set, which is like freely available on the web, and give it superpowers, like which is not really clear what kind of superpowers is that, or I mean it is, but you understand. So this really, I think, encapsulates what I call the art of repackaging, right? Like you take something that is freely available, blend it, put it on, like dress it up on a nice sort of interface, and then sell it back to public agencies that should have had these data in the first place. And again in the interviews, all these Gov-Tech firm founders were like, what we're doing is not sophisticated. It's like simple math. But, the city agencies or public agencies don't have the capacity to be able to do this work. So we come in and help them do this. So like that, even they were not sort of hiding or like hyping what they're doing in this GovTech space. But it's also, I have to say, it's not just like an internal capacity that these firms are exploiting. One of my actually, favorite is the wrong word, but like a favorite example is like one of the companies was telling me, so the city that we work with wants to have access to court eviction records at the state level. And if they know this data, they can actually help out those folks who are about to be evicted and provide some services, but the courts don't share that data in bulk. So we come in and we tell them, if you want us to do that, we can scrape it for you. And like, boom, you have it. So like, it's like, it could also just be like the fact that, especially I think in the US case, but I'm sure it's similar in other countries, like when different state agencies don't speak with one another and don't have these sort of data sharing capacities, capabilities, these firms really come in and exploit that as well. And I have to say, like, all of this obviously like changes. There's always tiered pricing in these services. So like all of these extra services are like new premium pricing kind of stuff. So it's all extra, obviously. This is also like, I usually get this question like, are they the new consultants, these firms? Like, according to them, they're not. Like, unlike the consultants, they present their stuff in PDFs. They actually, like, bring in something more dynamic and software-y. So I wanted to, like, add this code as well for anyone interested. Just want to, like, go into the third act, and I think this is where I want to sort of end. So obviously, since also these are all startups, all of these firms just want to scale up. Like, that's all they want. And when I ask them, like, what does that mean? They always say, like, well, we want to be the Google of whatever we're doing. We want to be the Google of housing data. We want to be the Google of, like, water utilities. We want to be the Google of, like, transportation data. And that's, from an economic perspective, that makes sense, I guess. But at the same time, what that means for them is not just being able to be this sort of one source for public agencies, but also if you're the Google of housing data, real estate companies are really eager to work with you. Or if you're the Google of transportation data, there are a bunch of private companies that are interested in like having access to the insights or data that you have. So when I ask them, like, how do you articulate the value to your investors? That's where almost like all my interviews went to and said, like, what we want to be able to do is to become this mediator between companies and government, because we'll collect all this information, like we could actually help them make better decisions. So I'm going to give you a really quick example about what that might look like. All the companies I interviewed are really small, so I don't have any examples from them. But there is this case that happened a couple years ago in the United States when the Federal Communications Commission wanted to put together their sort of federal broadband map, which was used to later sort of allocate public funds to state and city agencies. And this map was contracted out to a private company but the private company collected all the data from state agencies and the FCC itself. So even though they collected the data from public resources, which were freely available, because it's the private company that put it all together and claimed that they used their algorithms, later this was sort of launched as something to be licensed to public agencies, state agencies, if they wanted to use it. So there was like a big sort of scandal within the telecom space, like state agencies were like rightly angry about this. They didn't, like they sourced the data themselves, like why do they have to pay? But this is exactly the model that these Gov-Tech firms are going after. Get all the data that like public agencies have, dress it up, make it more beautiful, blend it, and then license it back to them along with the private actors that would have an interest in having them. So then I have to ask the question, like we talk a lot about like regulatory capture in the tech space especially, but this is like sort of regulatory capture 2.0, 3.0, right? Like this is tech companies wanting to be mediating the capture itself and not just capture government agencies. So, you know, that's sort of where I think where the stakes of this project are. So my questions for you, like help me figure out how to study this further. I'm an ethnographer, so obviously I'm interested in doing an ethnography of either a firm or a public agency, but any other ideas? Does this resonate with you coming from different countries? Because when I was collecting data, I kept going like, is this a US problem? Like, would this happen in other places? But, you know, in a country where, in a country where like the public institutions are constantly hollowed out, it seemed like a perfect opportunity for these companies. But I'm curious to hear from other country settings to see if that resonates. Where does the hype around like LLMs and large-scale AI fit into this whole narrative? Like when I was collecting data, this didn't come up as much, but as I'm going to continue collecting data, that's I think important. And then the design justice perspective that I want to bring into this project, like whenever I present this, I feel like people are a little bit like, yeah, we know the government's privatized, like what else is new? But I'm trying to sort of showcase the stakes of this and how this is like more than just privatization. So like what are the creative ways to make the harms of this transition sort of visible, you know, relatable, and in a way that could maybe be also more community driven rather than me sort of like studying up, if you will. So let me stop here and thank you.
Thanks, Burcu. That'll be a great conversation. But we have another great paper that's going to come first. Koffi, you ready? I just see you in the back. So Koffi Nomedji is a former Fulbright scholar with degrees in economics, sociology, and anthropology, including a PhD in cultural anthropology from Duke University. In addition to his research on how rural communities in Togo adapt to coastal erosion, he has extensive professional experience in rural development, which will inform what he'll share with us today. He's worked on projects funded by USAID, UN Women, UNICEF, and the European Union. He also founded a startup dedicated to fighting malnutrition in infants by working with rural women farmers. His current research delves into the intersections of AI, climate change, and development in rural communities in West and East Africa, which we'll hear more about in just a bit. Thanks, Koffi.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity. The title of my presentation is a bit boring, but actually it's a new research, and it means that I'm looking at the intersection of startups, local farmers, and AI technology. So by looking at this intersection, I'm focusing on AI technologies and indigenous knowledge by raising questions on ethics, justice, governance, and power relations. So, switch on. Cool. In the northern Ghanaian village of Bima, nestled amidst expensive fields of maize and millet, Kwame, a seasoned farmer, wakes up before dawn. The rhythm of his life, like that of his ancestors, is closely tied to the land and its cycles. For generations, Kwame's family has cultivated the soil, relying on a deep reservoir of indigenous knowledge passed down through storytelling and practice. However, the winds of change have swept through Bima. Climate change has brought unpredictable weather patterns, altering the once familiar cycles. Kwame, determined to secure a better future for his children, decides to embrace a new technology introduced by a local Ghanaian-owned startup, a cutting-edge AI device designed to provide insights into air temperature, humidity, and soil conditions. Kwame's first encounter with the AI device is both hopeful and challenging. The sleek device, with its promise of advanced data analytics, represents a bridge to a future where technology and tradition might coexist harmoniously. With the device in hand, Kwame hopes to gain the insight needed to optimize his farming practices and improve crop yields, addressing the persistent issue of food security that his village faces. However, as Kwame integrates the AI device into his daily routine, he encounters a significant barrier. The device, though proficient in data collection and analysis, struggles to grasp the intricacies of Bima's unique agricultural practices. These practices are deeply rooted in generations of local wisdom, encompassing knowledge about specific planting times, traditional pest control methods, and rituals that honor the lands and its spirits. For example, the device suggests that an optimal planting time based on its data, but Kwame knows that the local tradition of observing the behavior of certain insects and the blooming of specific flowers has always been a reliable guide. There is a disconnect between the technology's recommendations and the nuanced understanding that Kwame possesses. Moreover, Kwame faces a language and cultural barrier with the AI device. While the device communicates in English, Kwame and many of his fellow farmers speak Dagbani, the local language. The startup's representative tried to bridge this gap, but the subtleties of local idioms and the context of traditional practices often get lost in translation. Despite these challenges, Kwame remains optimistic. He engaged in discussions with the startup team, sharing his insights and experiences. The Kwame's journey highlights two things: the importance of AI tools for African farmers who are increasingly disoriented by climate change, and the importance of African farmers in the design of these tools. As an anthropologist and social entrepreneur, my research sheds light on how these technologies are collaboratively designed with local communities, examining the challenges, opportunities, and risks that arise at this confluence, particularly during a period of shifting climates. Today's presentation will shed light on the background power structure that is empowering the intersection of startup, farmers, and AI. And I will go on with the bigger picture, providing a bigger context. And then I will narrow it down to the macro level and to the relation between startup and farmers, and ask my research questions at the end. So, context at the macro level. Africa's agricultural sector is facing challenges in terms of food insecurity, climate change, and a rapidly growing population expected to double in the next 30 years. More than 95% of African agriculture is rain-fed, making it highly vulnerable to the increasing unpredictability of weather patterns. A recent World Bank report highlights the severity of the situation. 73 million people in Eastern and Southern Africa face acute food insecurity. And in West Africa, more than 50 million people experience hunger, especially in the Sahel region every year, and it keeps growing. Agriculture accounts for an estimated 35% of Africa's GDP and provides a livelihood for about 50% of the population. Smallholder farmers dominate the landscape, accounting for 80% of all farms and producing 90% of the food produced in the continent. These statistics underscore the urgent need for transformative solutions in the agricultural sectors. But as people say in the startup world, whenever there are challenges, there are also opportunities. And according to the World Bank and other major donors, digital technology and climate science are pivotal in boosting Africa's quest for resilient food system and transformation. And Africa's agricultural economy is the fastest growing in the world. Yeah, 44.1% growth compared to the global average of 2.7. And according to Deloitte, 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land is in Africa. So the continent has the potential of feeding each and every one of you wherever you are. I mean, that's quite a potential. And the president of the African Development Bank echoed this sentiment by saying, we must combine the best science, technology, and innovations to drive a more productive, efficient, and competitive agricultural system. Africa's food system have the potential to unleash $1 trillion in value for the next 7 years. That's big. And big money attracts big players. Yeah. So you have venture capitalists coming in, funding different initiatives, making deals with startups. And you also have big tech companies like Microsoft partnering with OCP, a global phosphate and fertilizer giant, to leverage AI for their digital agricultural platform in Africa. This collaboration aims to enhance soil health, optimize fertilizer usage, and ultimately boost crops yields. So they hope to ensure a more efficient and sustainable farming practices. So you have the Google AI Center example in Ghana to provide models to predict pest infestation. So another example is a company, a US-based company who's working with governments in the Southern and Eastern Africa to provide reliable prediction on meteorology through supercomputing technologies. Despite these high-profile partnerships and technological investment, the heart of Africa's agricultural transformation lies with the smallholder farmers like Kwame, who, as mentioned before, they represent 80% of all farms. Thus, the digital revolution in African agriculture starts not from the big companies or the multinational donors, but from the smallholder farmer. To truly understand the potential of digital innovations, we must focus on the intersection of technology and the farmer. This crucial point is at the farm, where startups introduce their cutting-edge innovations to the farmers. Here, technology meets tradition, and the collaboration between startup and smallholder farmers becomes the driving force behind sustainable agricultural development. So let's talk about startups. Quick definitions. Agtech or agri-tech or agricultural technology. It involves utilizing digital technologies to overcome market barriers and enhance agricultural productivity and sustainability. This is achieved by improving access to financial services, inputs such as seed, fertilizer, and agrochemicals. Also access to market information and share assets. And you have other terminologies that are related to agtech. You have ag fintech, which simply means to promote farmers' access to finance. You also have climate agtech, which means to improve farmers' adaptation to climate change. And loosely, you also have food tech, which are tech solutions that apply to food solution and by extension also to some local farms. Agtech are flourishing in all across the African continent. They are offering solutions tailored to the unique challenges faced by smallholder farmers. These startups are often funded by Africans who grew up in Africa, who some of them have nice stories about how they grew up in rural areas, how they used to farm with their grandparents or their fathers, and so on. And the good thing about them is they understand the local culture and they understand the local context. So they are providing, they have that potential of providing relevant solutions and technologies. So just to give a glimpse of the ecosystem, that's not the whole ecosystem, but like I just pick 4 startups in Eastern and Western Africa who are led by women and who are also friends as we navigate that space of startup ecosystem, going from one incubator program to another accelerator and so on and so on. So you have Marianne, who created AgriTech Analytics, a crop and soil management tool leveraging AI-powered satellite imagery, data analytics, and data from solar-powered IoT devices to halt soil degradation, crop pests, and diseases to end hunger in Africa. So her goal is to end hunger in Africa. And also they are very ambitious as well. Okay, then you have Farmio. They use greenhouse and AI. You have Farmer Lifeline, very interesting startup that is using AI technology to fight crops and pathogen. And Pollen Patrolers, one of my favorites. And Margaret, who founded that startup, is using bees to pollinate farms through precise technology and AI. Startups are developing AI-powered precision agriculture tools that provide farmers with real-time data on soil health, weather condition, and crop health. These tools help farmers like Kwame make informed decisions, optimize their resource use, and increase their productivity. However, the integration of AI into traditional farming practices is not without its hurdles. One of the most significant challenges is the communication barrier between these advanced devices and the farmers who use them. Kwame, like many other smallholder farmers, possessed a wealth of indigenous knowledge passed down through generations. His farming methods are deeply rooted in local tradition, cultural practices, and intuitive understanding of his environment. When Kwame encounters the AI device, he faces a learning curve that goes beyond just understanding the technology. It involves bridging the gap between modern scientific data and his rich experiential knowledge of farming. These intersections between actors and knowledge raise several questions in terms of AI design, ethics, governance, and power dynamics. But before we go to the questions, I would like to have a bracket and talk about the motivation of these startups. You have several social entrepreneurs who are motivated to make social impacts, to lift up their communities, but they are also driven by profit. Because, I mean, the thing of startup is all about valuation. Most of them, it's all about valuation and how to make profit and how to make yourself attractive to big investors and big companies. And that's where you have the intersection between these startups and big tech companies and other big venture capitalists. So the process goes like this. When a startup starts, it has a solution on the market. They call it minimum viable product. So you launch that solution, you start working. So the startup need to raise money to move on to the next phase. So they raise money by rounds. So this typically means if you have a first round of, say, you are raising 500,000 in the first round. You have investors coming in. They will put money into it, and they will also get a share of the company. And the next round, you'll be probably raising $2 million. They will have to get their money back on that next round, and other investors are coming in, taking more share in the company, and you reach a point where investors have a strong control over the company, and they can decide to sell the company to a bigger tech company, or they just control the decision-making process of your company. So this intersection is critical because, as you can see in the picture, this big company can just swallow up the small startup, and this raises a lot of questions in terms of the ownership of this technology, in terms of those who participated, especially the local farmers and their indigenous knowledge who are very instrumental in building this technology. So my research question is how smallholder farmers' ancestral knowledge and practices are being integrated into the design and functionality of AI tools developed by African startups. So in terms of design justice, asking what are the mechanisms that can ensure that farmers have a meaningful and equitable role in the design process of these AI tools. And it also raised some ethical considerations related to the deployment of AI technology in smallholder farming, particularly concerning the long-term sustainability of local agricultural practices. And it also raised questions on the ways in which the design and implementation of AI tools can promote a more just and equitable agricultural system that respects and preserves the cultural heritage and knowledge of smallholder farmers. In terms of profit-driven interests and farmers' need, I'm interested in knowing what are the implications of the intersection of the profit-driven motives of startups with the interests of multinational tech companies in the development and deployment of AI in smallholder farming. So this also raises questions in terms of power dynamics, like the ways in which to ensure that the power dynamics between local startups, multinational corporations, and smallholder farmers remain equitable. So these are my research questions, and the methods, obviously as an anthropologist, it starts with ethnography, and you can see me writing, I'm in the far left, using the, okay. So ethnographic fieldwork involves participant observation, working with farmers and as they are using these tools, but also being deeply into the startup ecosystem and looking at the ways in which these startups are navigating different programs. and also are in contact with different investors and companies. This involves doing interviews, focus group, and so on. But since my approach is multidisciplinary, involving cultural anthropology, STS, computer science, and even geography, I'm also planning to work with developers, do some workshop with them to discuss the integration of indigenous knowledge into AI tools, and also do some case studies. In terms of GIS, it's about doing collaborative mapping with the farmers and engaging the farmers in a participatory GIS mapping to document their knowledge of the land and their farming practices, and also to have a visualization of the AI deployment in this region. So that's in a nutshell the methodology I'm planning to use. I'm already using some of them, especially the ethnography, because I'm deeply into the startup ecosystem in West Africa and East Africa, and also working with some farmers in communities around. So the methodology I will be developing for the months or years to come as I go on with this research will be to work with computer sciences. I have no knowledge in computer science, and also GIS. I've already worked on other research with GIS, so yeah. Okay, I think I reached the end of my presentation. Thank you, but one thing, just remember, Africa has the potential to feed the world. You see, the African farmer carrying the whole world. Yeah, I just want you to remember that. So there's a huge potential, but how to get there is still, there's still a lot of questions. And please, from your questions and from your comments, I would like to learn more about what you think of making this happen or preventing, corporate capture and other things. Thank you.
Do you both want to come up and have a chat? You don't have to walk away. And I promise to share the mic. Well, I just wanted to say, I really enjoyed having access to these papers before everyone else. The live presentation was great, but it was great to see your citations, see your thinking on paper, so I'm going to share some of that in my comments. Well, just first, I just want to share that, I was really struck by some of the themes that span both of these examples, even though they're very different sites, and how you both have highlighted the tensions and negotiations that different local actors must make when engaging with the promises and possibilities of AI-related and digitized projects. And really how both those projects reflect really distinct assemblages, even as they encounter globalized trends. The local is still absolutely essential to how we understand them. So I have some comments and questions for both speakers, and I should say, because I had the papers in advance, there's no pressure to answer all of them. Think of them as food as thought. They're probably too much for our hour together. So for Burcu, I really valued the analysis of capture you presented here, and in fact, there's been a vibrant discussion of regulatory capture in other fields that I think you actually would advance significantly. And I wanted to highlight for everyone's benefit a piece by Wendy Lee that talks about the third phase of capture, which focuses on how capture becomes institutionalized. And I think what you're showing is clearly that, but also how does it become institutionalized through infrastructure? And just hearing a little bit more about how you could connect up to that would be terrific. And I know you don't know the piece, so you can't respond to this. But so what Lee does is really talk about this formation of capture as not something that happens between government and private actors, but it becomes an ingrained set of relationships through institutions. And she calls this process network embedding, noting it occurs when industries and private actors actually mobilize resources to physically embed themselves in policy and government domains. And I just feel like you're illustrating that so well that you're actually extending that really common social science frameworks around capture. So please go there. I also really appreciated the critical reflection on surveillance capitalism. But then, as you talked about the datafied state, I was wondering if that does the work that we need it to do, given the complexity of what you're showing us. And in fact, when we think about the state as like an apparatus, you know, it's always created and used data. So for me, like datafied state is like saying state. Like it doesn't really, I don't know if it does that much. And in fact, maybe you're actually challenging some of that work in the way that you're analyzing this case. And so I was thinking more that you're not really showing us how the state is changing, but more how forms of regulatory capitalism are becoming embedded in government institutions. And I'm happy to share that literature with everyone. But in this case, regulatory capitalism as a term is meant to capture the rise of both formal and informal regulatory forms that take hold through a series of networks, which you've illustrated for us, to steer behavior, incentivize change. So it's not just government actors distributing resources and delivering sanctions, it's actually how these actors are changing the nature of those institutions themselves. And I think you've illustrated it so well and in a way that's beyond monitoring and surveillance. So those are just comments. Again, no need to respond to them, but I do have 2 questions. And at first, it's kind of like, I'm wondering how this case is potentially different than other forms of like private-public partnerships that are really common in different government agencies and scales of governance. And like, what are the defining features that might make this distinct? Just to pull it out from other trends we've seen and how things are governed. And then I just would love to hear you reflect on how this example might mark a departure from more common neoliberal explanations of what's happening to governing institutions. You mentioned things being hollowed out, but something's filling it in as well. And so I'm just curious, you know, does this challenge the way we think about neoliberalism as we think we know it? And again, that's a big question, so if you don't have cooked answers, I get it. And then for Koffi, I just wanted to first acknowledge how much I really appreciated the ethnographic sensibility that you brought that's shaping this project. It's an approach that we've alluded to in our discussions, but we really haven't showcased in the Institute in the way that you have. You know, seeing your reflection on Kwame's encounters really help us see the broader insights we can glean from them and why it's so important that that should be our starting point for understanding these dynamics. One thing you didn't really mention in the talk, but you mentioned in the paper, was you mentioned how these changes were a critical juncture. And I'm really curious to see how that might get explored as the work progresses. So the academic literature on critical junctures suggests that there are often 2 paths that emerge at a critical juncture. One that will continue to follow past practice, even if it doesn't appear logical in the face of change, and that one that poses a radical break. And I'm just curious, as the research progresses, are there modes through which design justice interventions could enable that radical break that prevent the kinds of corporate capture that you were concerned about, or some other kinds of potentially extractive and exploitative set of relationships? Or maybe there's a third possibility, so I'd love to hear you reflect on that. I had one other question about, you mentioned the World Bank, you mentioned the African Development Bank, and I just wondered if your research has enabled you to get deeper details of some of those interactions. You know, are they shaping agendas or incentives that are affecting people on the ground? Or is this an interesting example where local knowledges are actually informing those networks? Because we don't usually think about these things as a top-down way, but you actually could be showing us horizontal and, you know, bottom-up approaches that might be informing this space. And then my last kind of comment and question was around, I love the idea of bringing together ethnography, collaborative GIS, all the things that you mentioned in an STS framework that might inform it. And in the paper, you cite Jasanoff and Latour. Everyone does that. And I'm wondering, because we've mentioned Anne-Marie Moll earlier, I wonder if we were like to think with her for a bit, who's also done work in different parts of Africa. You know, is there a way to think of this not as actors coming into this space and negotiating, but are they coming together in multiple forms to shape agri-tech in a new and emergent way? And so I wonder if it's actually a story of becoming, African agri-tech becoming, as opposed to interacting and manage these dynamics. But again, that's my rambling thoughts, but I'd love to hear what you all have to say, because it was really thought-provoking and stimulating, especially as we're nearing the end of the Institute, to think through these grounded examples. So thank you. Hello? Okay, it works.
Thank you, Kate. This is like above and beyond, honestly. This is super helpful. I'm going to jump into the two questions. How is this different from public-private partnerships, and how does this case depart from neoliberalism? So I think it is different than public-private partnerships in the sense that there's no partnership here. You know, like government agencies are clients to tech companies. So on the one hand, the terms of that interaction are very sort of boringly laid out, right? Like there are lawyers involved. Like it's not a fancy, like this is part of the reason why I mentioned my earlier work on smart cities. Like PPPs were very much part of that narrative, like these big companies coming in and using the public-private partnership as a way to maybe obfuscate the power imbalance behind the scenes that they were kind of pulling. But here it's actually much more straightforward in a way and much more mundane, which doesn't mean it's better regulated or like better understood, but I think that's, for me, is the main distinction. Like government agencies becoming the clients of the companies they are increasingly like having to regulate, and that's not new necessarily, but I think and maybe this brings me back to the neoliberalism and maybe a little bit Wendy Lee reference, but it's also different in the sense that like this is not like a water utility company wanting to work with a public agency, right? This is a tech company whose only expertise is in like data science, but bringing or claiming to bring expertise in another domain, and wanting to sort of monetize that expertise in both ways, right? Like for both public and private. And that, I think, really shifts what we're familiar with. And I think in that sense, like, it is in conversation with Lee's work, but it also is a little different. And I have to say, like, this is not very much a reality right now, and maybe that's part of the reason why not many people are paying attention to this. Like, these companies are smaller, their impact area is not very large, but this is the desire at the very least, and that's part of the reason why I actually liked talking with startups, because I think similar to Koffi's work, like the end goal for any of these companies is to be bought by Googles and Microsofts of the world, right? Like they're not trying to, I mean, they can claim want to be like Google of X, but they just want to be hired. And whomever wins, that model will scale up. How is that different from neoliberalism, or how does it depart? I don't think it's a departure necessarily, but I think, as you put it nicely, it's filling in that widening gap with data and dashboards and data analytics and automated decision systems, and making us think that there's something useful happening here, while what's really just happening is getting these companies rich and maybe crafting the way forward for the next phase of the tech industry. And this is why I wanted to end with a note on AI, because I hear a lot of the discourse around AI is like, we should get all the data that we can have. We should train our models on all the data. And governments have, as you said, like it's the state, it's not a datafied state. Like they have the largest repositories of data. And it's no wonder that these companies come in and they're like, let us digitize everything that you have. Like they pretend to do it for the public agency. They're doing it for themselves, right? Like they just need that resource. So I don't see it as a departure per se, but yeah, like you said, filling in with something more contemporary, whose implications that I think I'm still, at least personally, trying to figure out.
Thank you for your comments and also for your questions. What is interesting about this moment is that it's a juncture in the making. Mm-hmm. Everything is in the making. Like, to explain it better, when we are talking about, say, World Bank, GIZ, the German aid organization, USAID, and all of those. They used to work in local communities with local farmers through NGOs and community activists and workers. So what they used to do typically is to start with a small project, a pilot project that works, and then they will try to replicate it in other areas. And I mean, most of their initiatives have not worked as well as they were expected to. But now these organizations are shifting little by little towards funding startup houses or startup incubator programs in Africa. So they are expecting to come back to the term scale. They're expecting that those startups with their innovation may be able at some point to scale this innovation to the rest of the continent. So that would be an easier way, a more straightforward way to bring the pilot phase to the continental level. So it's also a new terrain for them by funding those programs and so on. The startup I co-founded, is currently part of one of these programs funded by the German aid organization, and it's typically promoting women in ag-tech and climate, green, smart climate technology, and so on in 6 countries in Africa. And my co-founder is a woman, so she just applied, and she's in the program. But it's quite new and quite interesting to see those actors coming into this terrain, and you don't know if there will be a break and there is something new in creation, or if we will come back to the same old project that have failed or that have never lived to the expectation, and so on. And I think about the last question. Okay. So about the becoming of the whole ecosystem, it's also, again, something in the making, because all these startups are new. Most of them are created in the past 4 years, and as you say, they are just trying to have a bigger valuation, get into a bigger thing, and so on. So how this intersection with big companies and startups and farmers will be transformed into something is still it's still kind of like what I'm trying to look at. Yeah. So I think we still need a few years to see where we are going and what we can make of it.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Thank you both for those reflections. I'm going to open it up to questions, but just in a comment, hearing you both speak, there are debates in other fields about if we're entering a new phase of 21st century capitalism that's not neoliberalism, that digital forms are driving things in different ways where it's not about, well, anyway, I won't summarize that work, but just hearing you both speak and the similarities to that, I think maybe we'd all benefit from reading it. So Susan Sell's written a very short piece that's open access, talking about 21st century capitalism as a research agenda. Unfortunately, and she's a leading scholar in international political economy, wrote about private power and pharmaceuticals and IP, lots of things. She unfortunately passed away recently, so hasn't done that work. But might be fun to share for us to think through critically if we're seeing something different emerging through these examples than past examples, because it seems like it, given both of what you've described. So questions from the audience? All right, I'll start from the back and work around. There you go,
Yeah, thanks for this really great presentation. I just have one question for Burcu and one really quick one for Koffi. So for Burcu, in Australia, for instance, there's a big push now for the government to actually develop in-house capacities as opposed to outsourcing different platforms or hiring consultants. Is there anything from your interviews that signals the extent to which these companies are a bit scared or a bit threatened by this possibility, or perhaps or is the landscape very different wherein there is really a big demand for outsourcing these capacities to external companies? And for Koffi, I'm just wondering, we mentioned like different kinds of technology. So you've mentioned that there's like agri-tech, there's like geotech, but then there's also like digital technologies. To what extent do farmers see the adoption of different kinds of technologies, and perhaps is there a particular preference for more AI or digital technologies as opposed to biotech tools or new irrigation or farming methods? Thank you.
Do we answer? Thank you. This is a great question. I believe the U.S. also has a unit that tries to do in-house stuff, but I don't think that's not that I asked in my interviews, but I would not consider that as a threat to what these companies are doing, mostly because these are, as Kate mentioned, these are very localized attempts. Not the companies themselves, but the way they approach the project is very local and very specific. That I believe they are part of like federal level conversations related to this, but also, yeah, in a place like the US, they would know that like whatever resources are available, companies will get more of it than an in-house agency. So I wouldn't consider that as a threat, but definitely in settings where, I was in Germany before coming here, and when I presented this work, like people also shared that feedback, like in a place like Germany, they have their own in-house investment in this stuff. Also, again, at the national level. So the idea of a Gov-Tech market did not resonate, for example.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Farmers will go for whatever works for them, whatever helps them. That's the first thing. Now, in terms of technology, in order to capture the preference of farmers, I think it's still in the emerging, because most of the startups are still at their pilot phases, and to really know the preference of farmers, we still need some time for those startups to scale up their solution, and then we can clearly see what solution farmers are preferring and what solution are actually working. And the other thing in this process is that the solutions don't come cheap. Yeah, farmers have to pay for it. Yeah, and that's the whole idea of startups. The idea is also to show that their solution is viable on the market. So farmers should be willing to pay for it, and several farmers should be willing to pay for it. As they generate revenue, they get bigger, they raise more money, they scale up. So we can only capture what works by looking at that curve of startup life journey. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you both. These were also really cool talks to hear back to back, so shout out to the organizing team as well. I have a brief comment and then a question to both of you. The comment was with regards to where you asked about different countries and contexts. I was like very briefly involved with like Gov-Tech stuff in the UAE through like an internship. And it's interesting there where you talk about like in the US, the government landscape being very hollowed out, giving the opportunity for all these private companies to come in. In the UAE, it's not hollowed out. There's like massive state capacity, and they're doing a lot of the stuff in-house. There's like a Minister of AI, there's a smart Dubai ministry, whatever. But it's still replicating the same capitalist tendencies because it just fits really well with the incentives of like an authoritarian structure. So it's really interesting to see that the same dynamics can proliferate both within a state context and outside of it. But my question to both of you is that I see these parallels in both of your research with regards to seeing kind of like well-intentioned, whether agri-tech startup founders or maybe civic tech startup founders who really do believe in their principles and think that they're the alternative to Silicon Valley, but then falling to capture, whether by, you know, like investors within the African context or whether by big tech and these like capitalist incentives in the US. And I'm wondering if you've seen examples of like resistance to that, not necessarily in an overt way, but examples of people who like don't want to be captured by investors or by big tech, and what that looks like.
Okay. Yeah, there are some founders who are simply, they say they are organic. Like they have an organic growth, meaning they don't get money from venture capitalists. They just grow by their business model. And some of them are very into what they are doing in terms of social impact, and they don't want to see foreign control on their startup or their solution, because they are really into the social impact and everything. So some of them are like that, but the majority, I mean, yeah, are simply looking for, you know, VCs, big tech companies, and it's understandable. It's not like I'm accusing them of anything, because to grow in the ecosystem, you need money, and you need a lot of money. Otherwise, you won't survive. Yeah, so it's understandable that they go that route, but making a clear cut between like how much of my startup I will have to give up and how much control I have to give up is still a tough question for many founders, and you hear that conversation a lot. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, it's a great question also because, so first, I mean, quick answer is no. Like I haven't, but also I have a very small sample. But it's a great question because when I was asking different investment models, like some of the startup founders were actually saying they're trying to stay away from venture capital because of this pressure to scale up really quickly. And you know, since they're working with government clients, like I mean, they weren't framing it as like we want to be good or whatever, but like since they work with governments, the growth model is very different. So they have to sort of find different types of investing. And that gave me an idea for the next phase of the project. Like it would be cool to sort of map out the different types of funding and how that changes how these companies try to grow, or if that makes any difference at all. But I have to also say one thing about like, I think there is this, you know, we can blame it on neoliberalism or capitalism and we won't be wrong, but I think from the in-house all the way to the venture capital model, there is this strange assumption that I'm sure you've seen also, that like whatever we're trying to build, it has to be shiny, it has to work like smoothly, it has to be like sort of fast. And that, like, you know, even when I interview public officials for other projects, like they always say, which I think is like an incredibly weird idea to me, because our residents, for example, for municipalities, work with like Amazon and go on TikTok, when they go on a government website, they expect a similar, efficient, fast, slick sort of design and dynamic, and they just can't accept that like things could be a little like more cumbersome and slower and inefficient. So I think that, I don't know if you want to call it an ideology, but that ideology of the shiny, new, slick, fast really impacts a lot of the decisions. and that inevitably takes you to the money route, right? Like even if it's in-house, like I think I'm not surprised at all that like even if it's entirely in-house, it creates the same dynamics and same products. So that's something that I like think about a lot. Like when did we create that, like manufacture that need on the parts of citizens or residents that they must have that, and that's how like our publicly funded institutions use that as a way to chase after money.
Great, we'll take 2 questions. Go ahead, Pam.
Okay, can you hear me? So this is probably a naive question, but I'm thinking if I were in, let's say, state government, maybe a municipal government would be too small, and someone said, hey, I'm going to sell you your own data back cleaned up with a really simple, equation, I would think, why don't I just hire a data scientist? Like, what, does anybody say, no thanks, we'll just hire someone in-house to do this? And why not? And then my other question, which is a side question, is I would love to know how you make a beehive smart.
Yes, so this is sort of in response to, I don't know how to pronounce your name, Burcu. Sorry, Burcu. Yes, thank you. Yes, your question at the end about comparative projects globally. I wondered if you had heard of the World Bank's involvement with ID programs in Africa, and I've read of this in India as well, and if you thought this was comparable. When I was researching some of these ID programs, I found that the World Bank was providing funding to lots of African countries to set up national identity databases, so that ostensibly they've created something called a right to an identity, which sounds nice when you think about it, but what they mean by a right to an identity is a right to, a duty to become legible digitally, something like that. And lots of African countries get funding to sign up, and then if you don't have an ID card, you can't register for a bank account or get a loan or travel or do anything like that. And when I was working on this research, some of the people I was working with said that countries like the US, for instance, and the UK did not have these foundational ID systems, and that for this reason, these countries had greater protections for their citizens because there wasn't one major database that foreign malevolent actors could hack and just steal all the phone numbers and everybody in a single country. But now with your presentation, I sort of felt that maybe the refusal of housing courts, for instance, to share or to make the data regarding, information regarding eviction trials, for instance, with city councils was an example of this. And I wondered if this was sort of like maybe an unwritten policy that courts and other government agencies sort of had in mind by refusing to make this data just widely accessible like that. And if so, do you think a great solution would be for there to be sort of like an explicit government policy saying that, like deliberately preventing or acknowledging, I don't know, limiting this sort of interoperability, the access of private actors, especially commercial ones, to these databases, and even some sort of mechanism that prevents other public agencies from a no bars held access to them. That's what I wanted to ask.
I'll reply really quickly. I don't think it's a naive question to ask, like, why don't they just hire someone? I think that's a very sensible question. But one guess I have, and I haven't interviewed the public side, right? Like, so I only spoke with the private side of things. So that's a good question to raise when I do interviews. But I think it's important to remember a few things. One, since I have access to some of the contracts of these firms, like the amount you pay to a firm, as an individual firm though, like ultimately you end up with a bunch of them, but looks more reasonable compared to an annual salary of another person. So I think maybe that's one way to rationalize internally, like, oh, we're just gonna pay, I don't know, 50K to this one company to work with 2 years, which actually often is, because there's, which I haven't gotten into this, but there's a luck-in effect in those, right? Like it's never only for 2 years, or it's never a pilot, right? Like it's much longer term. But I imagine that kind of a logic gets in the way of thinking we need to boost internally what we're doing. And I think also, I mean, in the US at least, but I think in many other countries, it's harder to attract people to work in public service. You know, the benefits are better, like outside and blah, blah, blah. So like there's a little bit of that. In terms of like protecting citizen data, like that's a great question, but I have to clarify one thing. The eviction records were already publicly available. Like any one of us could have just got on that website and Googled it and like and that's literally what the company did. Like that's sort of what I'm trying to get at with this. So if they had an internal person, the person could have done that. So this company was really just doing the labor of an individual that should have been in-house. So it's not necessarily about protection of citizen data in that sense. But what surprises me, and I think this gets at your point, part of the reason why they don't feel uncomfortable about this transaction between Gov-Tech firms and public agencies is that there is no, quote unquote, privacy concern, right? Like it's only about water use, or it's only about housing, it's only about X. Like, so there is this like, and I blame the tech industry for this as well, this specter of privacy is so much like haunting in these spaces that if that's not a concern, everything else is like fine and kosher. But it's not, right? Like, first of all, the privacy concerns still exist, but beyond that, it's not only about privacy, it's about other things too. So, so there is a little bit of that too. Like, I think these firms can move freely because, and public agencies don't feel the pressure because they think no one's selling citizen data or something.
Yeah, thank you for the question about how to make beehives smart. Actually, what they are doing is they get all the geographical data from, say, air, temperature, altitude, type of crops, the size of the farm and everything, to kind of know how they can deploy the beehives and have like a quote-unquote precise pollination. And yeah, that's one side of like answering your question. But now, and the other, what I just want to add, it doesn't have to do with beehive or smart, but it has to do with the use of AI and the concept of AI. There is a blurry game going on. You know, venture capitalists and, venture capitalists have the money. They want to put into something. And they want that money to return very quickly. And the only thing they are looking for as a quick return will be scalable solutions. So what is more scalable than a smart solution? A smart solution using AI, something that can quickly go over several countries by using the same mobile network or say, internet or something like that, is very scalable and can make money very, very quickly. So they are looking for those kind of solutions. And several startups who, even though they are not into that smart or AI frame, they try to frame their work so that they can be attractive to that kind of money. And for like most competitions and most programs that are out there, most of them are looking for deep tech, tech-oriented, tech-driven solutions. Because this program also want to get money from these VCs to fund the startup. So you get into that loops where people are driven by being AI or deep tech in order to be part of that table. So yeah.
It seems like if there are 5 variables that you need to predict the best deployment of your bees, you probably don't need deep machine learning to know that this needs to be pollinated now. This is a sunny day over here. It's too dark, dark or moist over here. But anyway.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I gotcha. Yeah. So this is as I say, that's some of the startup are just driven by that appeal, and others are genuinely into the real AI work.
Great, thanks so much. Before we take some in-room questions, I just wanted to remind everyone online, feel free to let us know if you have a question. I know there was one in the chat that's been removed, but if there are others, please let me know.
Hi, sorry, it's me again. I just wanted to follow up on the question on why don't they hire in-house. I think there's a range of reasons, but from my brief dark past in digital consulting, I think there's like 2 main reasons. One of them is because you don't just hire data scientists, you have to like manage the data scientists, and typically, especially people in government positions who are very far from technology, feel like they don't know what they don't know, and so they don't know what they need to assign a data scientist, like what else do they need, what kind of data scientists to do. So typically when you have these firms coming in, if they do want to hire in-house capability, the first thing they do is like tell them what jobs to recruit and what the job descriptions are. And so there's just like this divide between what people think they want and what they think is like so complex. And then I think it's also the obfuscation of like technology, like they think it's more complicated than it is. And that's exactly what these firms do. Like they'll come in and they typically don't exactly tell you what they're gonna do. It's just like, oh, we're gonna make this like big fancy AI technology. So you're like, whoa, this is something we could never do in-house. But actually, like, you could hire a data scientist who like works 5 hours a day and you could do it. But it's kind of part of the PR strategy to make you think that it's something that you're incapable of doing yourself. And then the last thing I'll say is also sometimes you don't need the capabilities year-round, and so it's easier to have temporary people coming in and out than like to have a full-time employee with benefits that you just like maintain the whole time. Yeah, that's just my follow-up.
Great. Do you all want to respond to that, or we'll move on to questions? Great. I know we have 1 online and 2 in person, so maybe we'll take the 2 in person and then tee up the 1 online. Is that okay? We'll do the 2. Yep.
Mine is in part a follow-up to what Aaliyah just said. There have been several reports indicating that nobody has yet made any profit from AI, right? In other words, there are people whose ownership of companies valued at, say, $80 billion have become fantastically rich, but those companies have not generated profit from AI. They have generated loss, and they have raised a lot of money. The largest profit makers from AI are consultants who are making a lot of money explaining AI to people who are dumbfounded by what this completely non-transparent thing is. So I think that's something to bear in mind, and that takes us to the point that Kate was making earlier, that, you know, it's completely true, right? We heard Sasha say several times, under capitalism. It's completely true that one could say, well, you know, your problem is not really with AI, it's with capitalism. But I don't think that that is a sufficient analysis, because capitalism is indeed a dynamic. And we now have accounts that what we are really in is a techno-feudal economy. That's something I wish that Edward was here because he's actually reviewing that book. We have for at least 10 or 15 years been saying that we are in a financial economy where people make money, selling paper for paper, rather, pure exchange value, no actual products being produced at a profit, but like services and fictitious profits being made by selling things. And that's exactly the startup economy that both of you are dealing with, where like once those A-round investors get in, they're going to get their payoff when the later investors buy stock from them. So they don't have to worry if the B startup is the dumbest idea in the world. It doesn't matter so long as those B rounders will buy it. The A round, and you and I don't, get to be A rounders. Nobody does. So I do think that especially insofar as we want to keep design justice and its ethos and its concrete practices in the mix, as both of you did in ways that I truly appreciate, that we need to have the most nuanced possible sense of what kind of capitalism we're dealing with. And I haven't even mentioned private equity, but I won't. But I bet that's who's buying that information about housing data, because that's what they do. They buy up the housing and make it unaffordable for young people to buy houses, who then get angry and either don't vote or vote for demagogues.
First, I want to say thanks to you both for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I had two questions, one each. And I remember, Koffi, you ended your talk mentioning the possibility of Africa to feed the world with the image of two people holding the world. And I just kind of alluded to this, but I was hopeful you could speak more about navigating that aspect, but also maybe wanting to get around the way that the continent is treated like a natural resource. And if you could maybe speak a little more to that, that would be great. And then, the question I had for you about capture, just like curiosity. I was thinking a lot when you were speaking about how Afro-pessimists would think about capture as a condition of blackness, and I wonder if that's related at all to how capture is being instituted. Like, what is the role of race in that, or how you're exploring that?
Feel free to respond.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you for your question. So when I say Africa can feed the world, I'm actually just repeating a sentence from Deloitte. So it's also a sentence that I like because it goes against the narrative of Africans are starving, they are not well fed, there is not enough food for them, and so on and so on. But if you know that the continent has the potential to feed the world, it means the continent has the potential to feed itself. So now the first step, or the first thing, or the main thing is to think about the ways in which we can leverage this potential to feed ourselves on the continent, and what are the kind of solutions that have to be put in place to do so. Yeah, and back to the natural resource continent that you were talking about. Yeah, it's also a big issue right now on the continent because Chinese are coming in and buying huge plot of lands and starting different form of farming and agricultural activities, and this is quite controversial. And this is going on in several countries in Africa, and I think this is a question that is being raised, and we need to discuss more about it, probably not here, but like the ways in which Africa should own its own lands and use these resources for itself, not others to come and, use these resources. Thank you.
Thank you. Before answering the question, I should also say, when you were presenting, Koffi, I thought about, like, from a investment perspective too, there's a lot, I'm sure you know, like from a geopolitical perspective. And it would be really interesting to hear, I have a colleague who works on this in the context of Ghana, but like I don't know what's happening in that Gov-Tech place, like what happens when we, rightly or wrongly, I don't know, imagine that there are these like two so-called superpowers, like US capital and Chinese capital coming in, and what happens to the entrepreneurial space in between, which I don't know if it's only those two, but like I'd be curious to hear later. The question about like, did I think about capture from an Afro-pessimistic perspective? No. Race, I think, only came up in the context of like all these companies, when I was interviewing, they kept making references to, I mean, they're based in the US, racial justice, to justify why their data expertise, data science expertise mattered, because I think I said it during the presentation, like they kept saying, you know, every municipality wants to make sure that they reach out to their like Black residents, but do they know where they live? And I was like, okay, I mean, how do you provide that information? And the answer was like a census tract or like a community neighborhood survey data, which like every academic has access to. So there's definitely capturing like a concept like racial justice, which is incredibly political and rich and complex, from the perspective of these companies, in order, like co-opt, right? Like in order to make a case for themselves. Like that was the only time it came up. But in the paper, I talk a tiny bit about this, and I'd be curious what you think about this. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this concept of captology. So anthropologist Nick Seaver talks about this, how platform companies, their end game is to like captivate us or to capture us on their, you know, wherever we are. It's either Netflix or Amazon or whatever. The idea is we don't leave, right? Like it's not about like sort of our data or whatever only, but just so we're like trapped basically in those spaces. So I talk a little bit about that in the paper in terms of like we imagine capture in tech studies in terms of that trapping. But it also, in this case, like capture also not just sort of preserves or traps, but also takes away something, or what we might call extraction, I guess, and transforms. So that was the only moment when I thought about that. But yeah, I'll be curious to hear more about like how you come into this and if there's anything that resonates with this concept. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. We'll take Kath online, and then I know Wes has a question.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
I feel a bit belated now because my question was sort of a follow-up to those series of questions around why it wasn't hiring in-house, but I'll put it out there anyway. I guess what I want to put into the conversation, there's been lots of really valid and I'm sure very important practical reasons for this disconnect being raised. But I wonder if either of the presenters have thought about the epistemic resonance between the way we think about data generally in academia, in public services, and in these sort of corporate capture. And I'm thinking also about the rhetoric of scalability, of smoothness, these sorts of ideas, and whether, you know, it's not so much only the sort of capitalist or whatever regime we're in at the moment, approach of these particular companies or of AI as a hype bubble, but just that we're sort of epistemically trapped in a notion of how data has to work that, you know, is sort of has as its figurehead the dashboard, you know.
Yeah, I have like a two-part question. So one is, like when you went into the research about like data in cities, but like government, Gov-Tech and things like that, what were some of the examples that captured your imagination of this concept of surveillance capitalism that floated out there, that drew you into this concept, that you may have dispelled maybe after or whatever? And then I guess another question is, like, are you familiar with like some of the dynamics that are happening in Detroit with like public-private, but then also companies that have actually morphed based on different economic reasons and have grown almost exponentially since their inception, but that were not data companies at first, that have turned into data companies? And then I think also like this idea of surveillance capitalism in a place like Detroit is a very much real thing, where you have these data companies actually building their own, one company that has control over its own private police force. It is also a mortgage company, which is also has cameras on every building downtown, even on buildings that they don't own, and then own the majority of the land in downtown Detroit. And then on top of that, do land swaps with the city to build jails and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, as a comment to Kat's question, in my research, what I realized is that several startups, what they have to do, they have to show their product to the investor and then to the other partners. So they make it, yeah, sleek, fast, nice, and everything. But at first, for the investor, for the partner, because it has to go into that space where the investor are expecting something like that, right? And then speaking of data, by making all this, product and tools, they are also working with farmers and collecting a lot of data from farmers. Before I came here, I was in Germany for another startup program meeting, and I met someone from Bangladesh, a founder, who came to Germany just to sell what you call insights to a partner there. So he's basically selling data from farmers, from his platform to a company in Germany. So you have also that dangerous intersection where data is being fed to companies in the Western world who can transform into, I don't know, but surely to extract more value and more value. And this is also very critical, right?
Thank you. Thank you, Wes. These are like great questions. What were the examples that pulled me away from surveillance capitalism? So I have to say, I made the mistake of presenting this work at the conference for surveillance and society, which is a collection of amazing people, but they disliked the idea so much. And you know, that's why I was also sort of emphasizing over and over that, like, I'm not saying there's no surveillance capitalism and it's all capture now. Like, that can't be true, obviously. But the distinction for me was, and maybe this is me having done that work on smart cities, which is all about let's put sensors out there, let's put cameras, and let's collect data. These founders were, first of all, like, without me prompting, were like, we don't do smart city stuff. We don't want to collect new data. We just want to help these public agencies work with what they have. And first, at the very start, I actually was like, could that be a good thing? Like, maybe these are not the sort of bad actors that I had been dealing with. And I think they, you can call it, I'm not going to litigate like what their intentions were, but maybe in a way that was a response to what we might call the failure of smart cities, that they were trying to distinguish themselves by saying, we don't want to go in there and like get into the hardware stuff. We just want to work with what you already have. And that's where I kind of started to think more about capture. And also the idea of both like sort of all of that stuff that was collected in the previous period, like with the cameras and stuff, had to become quote unquote useful for capitalism. So I was like, maybe capture is that complementary sort of mechanism, and this is why I like like having thought of this together. But at the same time, like I have to also say like their practices very much reminded me of the same, right? Like they're not, like they never bring in new data. Even the stuff they introduce to the public agencies as new has already been collected somewhere else. So I think that was the main reason, which doesn't at all mean everything that you just described like doesn't exist, but there is a complementary mechanism here that feeds off each other and that makes the whole thing grow. And I'm trying to think because, and this is why I bring up the design justice perspective, like I can think of how to push back against surveillance capitalism politically, but I can't immediately think about how to do it with capture. And and that's why I like the concept, like as a challenge, like how can we mobilize people around this idea, and in addition to what's already been going on. Yeah, I'll stop here.
No, that's great. I appreciate we're nearing time, but we've got a queue of questions. So we'll take 2 more and then we'll conclude and encourage everyone that has more questions to continue speaking after we formally conclude. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I mean, I kind of really like both the presentations. Both of you are not geographer, but I can clearly see it's talking about 2 different kind of scale and how you people did the ethnographic work around the macro structure, which is very fascinating and encouraging. I just have a question for, Koffi at this moment. Like you're talking about the GIS collaborative mapping. So, many of us kind of believe that cartography is a very positivist practice, but it has also a different kind of politics. So cartography also help a lot of entrepreneur or the capitalistic venture to identify the place to explore. So when you are talking about the collaborative mapping, are you kind of approaching it as a kind of a counter practice? And if you are kind of, can you actually engage with the farmers in this process and make a counter map which can kind of talk about interactive storytelling or something? Or how, I'm curious to know how you are kind of approaching this framework of collaborative mapping. Yeah.
Great, and then we'll have Ali give the last question.
Thank you both for this great presentation. I think as you were both talking, it just sort of made me think about collaboration that you were talking about. And I know, Burcu, that you said it's not necessarily a partnership because it's the government agencies are more of clients. But I think with the previous comment, it's really bring it back, particularly with your third act, which is sort of how then these startups get to be bought by the Google of the world. And so to me, this really brought back the questions of collaboration. And I was wondering, I don't know if it's a question, it's more also a reflection about how existing sort of the international norms, thinking about Sustainable Development Goal, the 17th Sustainable Development Goal, which is Partnership for Goals, and sort of how that itself sort of legitimizes collaboration between government agencies, international organizations, and private tech companies, for example. And then more and more you have companies like Microsoft, they have these labs like the AI for Good Labs and others. So I was wondering whether you think existing, I don't know if it's regulation or governance mechanism, from the international standpoint, they sort of enable or legitimizes more and more collaboration, and how does that then sort of push back or enable capture?
Thank you for the first question. Doing the participatory GIS mapping basically is to see how farmers are making sense of their use of these devices. So The idea is to map their farm and then to be able to locate the farms where the device is used and to see if the device has been successful, if it has used more crops or not, comparing to those who are still using the old and traditional practices. So basically, if they have that knowledge, they will know, like, okay, how this thing is working and what kind of benefit they're getting from the devices. And that information can be also useful for the startup as well, but it will help create a sort of conversation between the startup and the farmers. And I hope to learn more about how this conversation goes and also like the flow of information from one side to the other and how that build up the whole solution or AI tools. Yeah.
Thank you, Ali, for this question. So I don't have a great, like, sort of succinct answer to this really important question, but I want to say two things. One also maybe relates to Wes's comment. Like, the way this study has been designed also determines the limits of it, right? Like, so for example, I'm not looking at companies that try to go after police departments. Like, I'm sure there's a capture story going on. I mean, Palantir's like starting with that one, right? Like, so I'm sure there are like smaller versions of this. Or I'm not talking about like Microsoft, Google, big AI projects for government. This was a conscious choice on my part. Like, this was coming in at the end of my book project, and I wanted to be able to have access. Basically, I was like, who would talk to me for hours? That's startup founders. They love that. And I was like, that's good. Like, you know, and that gives me a sense of like where they think the market is going, right? And or which public agencies would invite me in-house. Like, that's not going to be a police department, or it might, but you know, I'm not a US citizen. I have a foreign name, and like it'll be a lot harder for me to have that kind of access. So there is a little bit of that in the story. And also but at the global level, I also want to say, from what I could observe, there is really a similar case of, so one of the, like a side project I'm doing is about Google's influence at the city level. And one of the case studies we're looking at is Google's environmental insights tracker index, whatever they call it. It's, I think Kate is familiar with it. It's a phenomenal project where Google is like, hello, municipalities, we have machine learning capacity. Let us help you figure out your like carbon emissions tracking, sustainability goals. Let's work with you. It's all, you know, across the world. We can't have access as individuals. We have to be affiliated with a local government to have access to that data and all kinds of stuff. A colleague of mine has been interviewing people who work with Google in small German cities. And what actually is happening is public officials building Google's future database while Google is pretending like they're helping cities. And I'm sure there are similar examples that, like, you know, any one of us from our sites like can talk about. So that capture dynamic again is happening, right? Like, every city is contributing for free just because they want to be affiliated with Google or Microsoft, or to be able to say like, oh, we've been part of this pilot program by Microsoft or whatever. But they're basically doing the data labor of some future project for these companies, which we don't even know if it's going to work or not, right? So like, it's not a great answer to your question, but I think like the legitimation phase is over in my experience, but it's like, now we're actually all working for these companies, whether we want it or not, right? Like, so it's not even that like they're coming in presenting something to these, you know, resource poor organizations. Even though our resources are minimal, we're still helping them get bigger, is to me the big shift that I've been seeing recently.
Maybe I also like to add one example. Last year we were at an incubator program in Washington, and one of the partners of the program is Amazon Web. and they invited us in their new headquarters in Arlington, and they took the pain to spend a whole afternoon explaining us how to input data into their Amazon web sites. And they gave us 25,000 in Amazon web credits. So pretty much it's like you putting data into it, like they explain how the data will help us and everything, the AI will help us and everything, but actually they are just collecting data from us. And back to the regulation question, in Togo, for example, there is no regulation around startups. There is no legal framework that actually defines a startup. So the ways in which startups are using data they collect from the farmers and so on is not legally defined, and this regulatory hole can lead to more critical questions in the future in terms of, like, ownership of those tools that have been built. Yeah.
Terrific. What a note to end on, though. Please join me, everyone, in thanking our terrific two speakers. We're going to close formally for now, but again, as I said, please do continue the conversations. We are going to pause after this formal closing so that Lauren can make a few announcements for those in person. So we'll turn that over in just a bit.
This isn't being recorded, right? Great. So a couple of things that I want you to be aware of. As you may recall, Nikki helped to set up a document that we're using in lieu of a Google document. Yesterday, when we had the rich conversation, I was furiously taking notes. Please do, stop into the document and make sure that I did not misrepresent your views. I was typing as fast as I can, but I think that you should have the last word about what you were actually trying to say, or correct your name if I misspelled it. Edit and add and delete as you wish. I also have some amazing news, which is that we anticipate approximately 4 additional members of the Design Justice Network to join us this afternoon. They were super responsive to the invitation